one thing I want to be a little cautious about, like you talked about, some folks kind of have traits that make them more susceptible. That's a little bit true, but we have to be a little careful because most of us are potentially susceptible to this. We have to be a little
Hmm.
careful thinking there's a certain type of person that's dumber or whatever, and they're more susceptible. I mean, we can all start going down those, and we all do go down those paths to some degree. We might draw the line somewhere, but these kinds of phenomena are going on with all of us. We're doing this whether we know it or not. Well, we almost never know it, or at least not to the degree
Right.
it's happening. We might kind of be a little aware, but it's not to the degree we know it. But there are some traits, and one of the traits that seems to make people a little more susceptible to that kind of messaging, where it's like, "I'm your savior," just listen to me and everything will be great, is folks that have a harder time. I forget the exact language around it, but folks that have a harder time sort of accepting, sort of simultaneously holding on to two thoughts at once, or two kind of contrary positions at once. The idea that I can simultaneously, sort of maybe believe you're wrong, but still listen, to your reasoning and your rationality for how you came to your conclusion, right? Just because I
Right.
listen to it doesn't mean I have to agree with you, right? I mean, I think sometimes we're just afraid to listen to people because, well, they're going to try to convince me. Okay, but you don't have to change your mind. No one's making you change your
Totally.
mind, right? And I think sometimes we're almost afraid of that. Like we don't want to have that conversation because they're going to try and change my mind. But so that's one thing, is folks that have this kind of a little bit more black and white thinking, I guess, is the simplest way to think of it. And if you're in a black and white thinking mode, to a larger degree, that is one trait that can make you a little bit more susceptible. We still have agency to not fall into these rabbit holes, though.
Right.
And some of it is, you talked about, people will do their own research. I mean, that's, you talk about a trigger. That's one of mine, right? The people that say they're doing their
Yeah.
own research, because what are almost always doing, and I'm sure you know about the phenomenon of sort of motivated reasoning, right? Where we kind of have a conclusion we want to draw, and so we go, we do all this reasoning to make the facts fit. Even if they're real facts, we make sure our interpretation of those facts fit our moral motivations or
Right.
some other motivation.
Or you find a study that you have no qualification to evaluate, and you just take the headline, and you'd be like, "Well, look at this. There's this study
Right.
that proves this point." And then once you start bringing that out, it kind of kills the conversation because you're like, "Okay, okay, I guess that study is there," but because there's not a real expert in the room to sort of dissect that study and what we're talking about, then it kind of throws a bomb sometimes into a conversation that sometimes could be more nuanced.
Yeah, the nuance is a key factor here, and that's part of that. When you have that more black and white model of the world, accepting that nuance. And now all humans have a trait toward this, right? I mean, it's part of our
Hmm.
survival mechanism, right? We kind of have to simplify the world, or we couldn't deal with it, like it's too complicated. So we have a tendency to do that. Like we do like simpler answers. We do want to kind of simplify things. And then sort of, especially once we've kind of made a moral judgment, then we want to just nail that down. It's like, I'm done. Like I don't need to think anymore. I mean, there actually is a phenomenon that's called, make sense stopping rule. So in other words, it makes sense stopping to evaluate it anymore, right? I'm just going to stop here. Like I've gotten far enough. I like this answer. I'm not going to do any more, quote unquote research.
That's
And
great.
for a lot of those folks that say, they're doing research, I like to call it, like I said, there's the motivated reasoning thing. I like to call it like motivated Googling is what you're really doing, right? Um,
Right.
and we all probably do that to a degree, but I mean, you have to get better at all those critical thinking skills. It's not natural. Like people think I'm a good critical thinker, like naturally. No, no, you're not. You have to go learn about it, and then you have to practice it. So even reading the book about critical thinking is not going to be enough, and you need to actually go practice those skills and re-practice them, because our tendency is to go back to these basic psychological cognitive biases and fall into it without knowing we're doing it. So you actually have to
Right.
actively practice those behaviors. And one aspect of real critical thinking that often people leave out is sort of the peer review side, right? You should have a network of people that you can trust, and folks that will give you real criticism and say, dude, you're off the rails here, man. And someone that you trust that can tell you, that give you that feedback. Or,
Right.
here's a place maybe there's some more research you don't know about, or something else you could look at. And if you don't
Well,
have that, then, whatever you're doing doesn't quite fit the definition.
right. Well, the funny part is that when you say critical thinking, or people consider themselves critical thinkers or logical thinkers, etc., um, the thing that gets frustrating is that we tend to in society think that people with less emotion or less emotional resonance are able to make more logical thoughts and better decisions. And that is just not true. Like there have been plenty of studies with people who have frontal lobe damage that for some reason cannot connect to any emotions in their life, and these people cannot make decisions to save their life. Like they can't make a decision what to buy at the grocery store. They can't make reservations at a restaurant. Like it really shuts down people's ability to be able to have agency and decide things in their life. And so all this to say, I think when we're thinking of critical thinking and logical reasoning, like for one, you can't logical reasoning yourself on a topic you don't understand. So there's no you can't follow a logic. I can't be a critical thinker and walk into a operating room and do open heart surgery. Like that's not a thing that I could do. And and so I think with some of these things we have to realize, one, all the unknown unknowns. We have to accept all the stuff that we know we don't know, but then also we have to take into account what do I feel about this topic and what do I want to be true. And so I
Right.
remember when I was, I think, mid 20s, I watched some, yeah, I guess it was 2001 was the, yeah, I must have been early to mid 20s. I was watched some insane conspiracy theory about 9/11, and I was convinced it was an inside job, and I was showing my friends this video, and I was convinced that I was the prophet and all of these things, and they're like, yeah, all right, maybe. And I was like, no, but because this and this. And I don't remember how I changed my thinking on that. Like obviously I don't think that anymore. But for some reason now, if I hear something that's very popular or I find myself believing something, I always will like to look on the other side of that and to see how credible the evidence is in the opposite direction. What sort of people are saying these things? Like you can obviously tell some people who have a straight agenda that they just want to fit their worldview to what they're saying. Are there any good studies that I can look on these things? And what do I think is okay? Maybe this is real. Maybe it isn't. But I think over time the hard part is really accepting how much we don't know. I think that's the hardest part about all of this. At least I found, because I've spent at least a lot of my 20s arguing with a lot of people over a lot of things, and most of them have been good natured. Some of them have got out of hand, but I think even now that I try to be way more nuanced in my view of things, the hardest part is accepting that, like, yeah, like the limitations of my knowledge. It's just a pretty low ceiling for all of us. Like even like the people that are Stephen Hawking's or whatever. I'm sure you give Stephen Hawking something on psychology or history, and he's an idiot.
Right.
And so I think that's the hardest part. I think for all of us is just to realize, like, my limitations as this silly human are maybe greater than I would like to believe.